Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's showcase session. Our session this morning brings together some of America and Israel's top political leaders, policymakers, and thinkers. We'll get a look at politics inside both countries and the people behind some of the most important policies affecting the region. Our first guests today are two top administration officials guiding U.S. policy towards Iran. Our first guest has served as a member of congressional leadership staff, a Supreme Court clerk, and has been a senior administration official in a number of positions. At the beginning of it all, Sigal was a colleague of ours at AIPAC and worked with me 25 years ago at AIPAC. In her current role, Sigal Mandelker serves as Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Treasury Department, where she is responsible for cutting off the financial lifeblood that supports terrorists and their allies. Our second guest has also worked on Capitol Hill and in several senior executive branch positions. Brian Hook was Assistant Secretary for International Organizations in the George W. Bush administration, where he also served in senior roles at the White House, the UN, and the Justice Department. He now serves as the State Department's Special Representative for Iran and as the leader of the Special Iran Action Group. Please join me in welcoming two close friends, Sigal Mandelker and Brian Hook. Thank you for coming today. It's a very important time, and the two of you are playing very important roles at a critical moment in our nation's history and in a critical moment in policy towards Iran. Brian, I'd like to start with you. As I said, you're the leader of the Iran Action Group. You are the leader of the effort in the State Department to focus our Iran policy, and a lot's happened in the last year. The U.S. has withdrawn from the Iran nuclear deal, and I thought it'd be helpful to start our discussion if you laid out our strategy going forward with Iran, what are some of our goals, and what do you think already some of the impact has been?
Good, and I'd like to thank Arnie for having Sigal and me here today. I first spent time with Arnie in 2014 when he led a trip to Israel, an AIPAC trip that was, I'd worked on Middle East issues in the Bush administration pretty extensively, but there really is nothing like an AIPAC trip to Israel, and it's enormously beneficial for the work that I've done in this role. On the Iran side, because I work very closely with the Israeli government. And so to answer your first question, being outside of the Iran nuclear deal gives us enormous leverage to go after the broad range of threats that Iran presents to peace and security. And so what we've done is really concentrated our energies around the oil and the financial sanctions, and we've got the oil at the State Department, and Sigal works on the financial side. Since we've gotten out of the deal, we've been able to take off well more than half of Iran's oil exports, which is a good thing. There is a lot more to come, but we have already denied the regime many billions of dollars in revenue. Now, when the president got out of the deal in November, Foreign Minister Zarif, who is sort of the titular foreign minister, the real foreign minister of Iran is Qasem Soleimani, but he had said that Iran will thrive under sanctions. We recently had President Rouhani say that Iran is facing its worst economic crisis in its 40-year history. And we have another good data point. The leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, he recently made a public appeal for donations. It's a good thing. That's a very good thing.
We hope it's doing very poorly.
Yeah,
we
want him to be doing very poorly.
We're cutting off the donations, don't worry.
We know that money is the sinews of war. Iran historically has provided Lebanese Hezbollah with $700 million a year. And they give $100 million a year to Hamas and to Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We are, through our campaign of maximum economic pressure, which is by historical standards, the largest sanctions regime in history against Iran. We are going after their revenues in ways that I don't think the Iranians thought imaginable, and we are just getting started.
That's great. So let's go from oil to finance. Sigal, your organization at the Treasury Department is the tip of the spear. You are out to impose a financial cost on Iran, impose sanctions that choke off financial support for the regime. Can you talk to us a bit about your organization and then a bit about, too, the impact that you're having?
Happy to do so, and again, thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to be at this conference. The first one I went to was about 26 years ago, where we were hoping for 2,000 people, so this is very exciting. So I oversee our economic sanctions program. I've got OFAC, which is really the heartbeat of the sanctions program. I have an intelligence agency, a policy shop, and I've FinCEN, which protects our international financial system from money laundering in many different ways. OFAC, actually, just to give you a little bit of history, was born out of an effort in 1940 to keep Hitler from having access to billions of dollars of revenue. They realized at that time that they could use the great economic might of the United States to seize assets of countries that Hitler invaded. And they literally were able to keep billions of dollars out of his hands. Didn't stop the terrible atrocities, of course, that happened in World War II, but imagine what he could have done had he had access to that revenue. And so at the same time that was happening, my parents were in hiding in Poland, and so it's with that history, that great history of our organization, that we approach this problem that we have with Iran, and we are systematically going after their ability to move money, to raise money, and get access to revenue. On the day that the president, for example, made the decision to withdraw from the deal and to take the historic decision to reimpose nuclear sanctions, which we are enforcing in great degree, we also had the single largest action that we've ever had in any program when we imposed over 700 sanctions against a number of Iranian individuals and entities, including more Iranian financial institutions than in the history of that program. And of course, we were able to secure the agreement of SWIFT to cut off many of those banks and the Central Bank of Iran from the global financial payment system. We are also disrupting scheme after scheme that the Iranians have been attempting to use to move money. So just as an example, in November, we disrupted and exposed a scheme in which you had the Central Bank of Iran, Hezbollah, a so-called humanitarian company try to move money through Russia, ultimately to supply oil to Syria using Iranian oil. At the same time, that same scheme was moving millions and millions of dollars through Syria to the Quds Force, Hamas, and Hezbollah. And on that day, we took great action to disrupt that network, and we're doing that every single day.
That's great. That's great. Brian, let's talk a little bit more about oil. As you said, the U.S. has already had a huge impact on the amount of oil that Iran is able to sell. I would anticipate that the goal is ultimately to get it to zero, to have a complete cutoff of Iranian sales. Tell us a bit about where we are on that path, and are we going to continue to extend waivers or exemptions to some countries to continue to buy Iranian oil?
Yeah, where we stand right now is that prior to the president leaving the Iran nuclear deal, there were 23 countries, somewhere over 20 countries that were importing Iranian crude oil. That set of countries are now at zero. So 80% of the regime's revenue comes from oil exports. So if you want to go after the money, you really have to go after the oil. And we had a pretty tight and fragile oil market last year. And as a consequence, we had to grant just a very small number of waivers because the president wanted to avoid volatility in the oil market. And so what we were able to do when we got out of the deal in May, I think Brent was trading at 74. We took off over 1 million barrels of Iranian crude, and Brent was at around 72. And so we were able to balance our national security and our economic interests. The 2019 picture for global oil supplies is much better, and that allows us to accelerate our path to zero. So we, Secretary Pompeo, the President, there is a great desire to get to zero as quickly as possible. We've made we have brought them to levels of oil exports that they've never experienced. And so we're going to continue that.
You're going to take it lower?
Yes, we will take it much lower.
Great. Well, Sigal, you talked about the impact that your sanctions have, but there's obviously attempts to cheat, to evade what you're doing. And in fact, there's even efforts now, we've heard about efforts the Europeans may have to create special ways of providing payment that would, they think, evade the sanctions you have. How effective can we be in preventing people from evading your sanctions?
Look, I think we've been very, very effective. You've seen droves of companies move out of Iran for fear of confronting our sanctions. And what we've told our European counterparts repeatedly is, number one, we're going to go after sanctionable activity no matter where it occurs. So that's a red line for us. Number two, what the Europeans need to understand is that when they are dealing with the Iranian regime, whether it's through some trade vehicle or any other means, they are dealing with a regime that spends hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in supporting terrorism, in destabilizing activity all over the world, in grave human rights abuses. This is a regime that sends child soldiers to Syria to fight and to die. And so they need to be extraordinarily careful, because it's very difficult. If you're dealing in Iran, it's very difficult to know who you're dealing with. There's no transparency, and they're intent on moving that money to do very destructive things. And so in our messaging to the Europeans, we say, watch out, because what you don't want to find out is that the trade that you're executing or trying to executing ended in the wrong hands. And the Europeans need to understand that, because they've, of course, been victims very recently to assassination plots by the Iranians that thankfully they've been able to disrupt so far, but that they're intent on carrying out. So our message is, no matter what it is, if it's sanctionable, we're going to go after it, and beware.
Yeah, I think if I were CEO of a company and was in a meeting with you, I'd think twice about trying to cheat. Brian, let's talk a little bit. You look at Iran's impact across the region, and one of the biggest places we see that impact is on Israel's northern border, what they're doing to support Hezbollah, what they're doing to support militias in Syria. What kind of impact can we have in supporting Israel and in our own policy to address Iran's reach across the entire region?
Right. Iran certainly has, the regime has ambitions to create this Shia corridor of control that runs from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Bahrain. And it is our policy to reverse Iran's power projection state by state. It's very important that we get back, that Iran, as Secretary Pompeo said, Iran can either start behaving like a normal nation or it can watch its economy crumble. And we are trying to restore a sense of what Iran needs to do in order to have a much better future for its own people, but also to make the Middle East much more peaceful. I think that Iran has been so successful at its proxy warfare in the gray zone, using Hamas and Hezbollah and the IRGC and the Quds Force. They've been successful at it for so long that I think a number of countries have become desensitized. And we've lost the ability to imagine a peaceful Iran. And I think the Iranian people are in a much different place than the regime. This regime does a very bad job of representing its own people to the world. So what we're trying to do is to deny them the revenue at the front end so that they then can't, and we're already seeing this, aren't able to, for IRGC and Quds and all these other groups to make payroll. And so we're going to keep pressuring them. Iran is very good at using conflict. Where they see conflict, they go in. They saw conflict in Syria, and now they're trying to use Syria as a forward deployed missile base to attack Israel. And Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu has done a great job of pushing back very aggressively on that. We fully support Israel's rights to self-defense. They need to keep doing that. So, and we're we're very much looking forward to the Prime Minister coming here. I met with him shortly after getting the job. I went to Israel and met with him for well over an hour and had a very good discussion. I worked very closely with everybody on his team. And so I think there's terrific coordination right now. Look forward to everything coming this week with our meetings with our counterparts. I saw Alon Ushpiz on Friday. We're in regular touch, and it's really good.
Great. Well, Sigal, maybe you could also just add, you're doing a lot of creative things to put more financial pressure on organizations like Hezbollah. What can your office do to try to increase the pressure?
So we're increasing every single day. So last year, actually, we went after more Hezbollah financiers, front companies, seemingly legitimate, but we know not business operations than we've ever done in the history of our program. And you're just going to continue to see more of that. We designated, just as an example, a bank in Iraq that had been involved with the Central Bank of Iran in moving money for the Quds Force and Hezbollah. The same day that we did that designation, we again exposed the Central Bank of Iran's governor, who we also sanctioned. He's no longer the Central Bank of Iran's governor. So we're just going to continue to up and increase that fight. We're going to continue, very importantly, to go after the financial facilitators, right? These operatives who are all over the world, whether it's West Africa, Europe, in the Middle East, you name it, who are trying to move and raise money to support Hezbollah, and we are systematically cutting them off at the path, and that's just going to continue in great spades.
Yep.
Well, Sigal and Brian, you have very difficult jobs. You have very important jobs. They mean a lot to the country. They mean a lot to the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I know everybody in this room is very appreciative for all that you do. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.